Chapter 2. Sabir. The halls echoed the sounds of hard-soled shoes pacing back and forth on the cobblestone floor. The diminutive man, just over 5 feet, rambled to himself at an unintelligible pace. Despite his frenetic babblings, he carried himself with the elegant grace that spoke of his royal lineage. The more he spoke to himself, the more he was convinced his brother was conspiring against him. The gaps in his logic were lost amongst the decades of misplaced jealousy. Suddenly, he came to the realization that he never had to suffer these indignities again. He commanded the Shafra, an assassin known throughout the aired lands as the most capable of all assassins. As he glanced down at his slave assassin, who was already prostrated at his feet, the corners of his mouth began to curl upwards. "In front of everyone tonight, I want him dead, and his entire fucking family executed." Sabir responded by blinking. He was baffled as to how such a trivial transgression could elicit such a visceral reaction. In all his years in service to his master, Sabir was used to his impetuousness. It was an order he usually wouldn't question. But the request was beyond absurd. "My lord," he said, as if he hadn't heard him correctly. Prince Nasim stilled him with a glance. "My lord, you don't want to see your nieces and nephews killed for such a thing." Sabir posed the query, but he was already aware of what the response would be. "His wife is expecting," he said, "and he's your brother." Sabir hoped the sound of the heinous act he wanted his slave assassin to commit would cause him to reconsider. Prince Nasim Hamid gave his slave assassin an enraged stare. He finished another overpriced glass of wine and continued, "I want them all dead." After a short pause, he added, "By dawn if it suits you," he said coldly. Sabir nodded in agreement, even as he carefully considered methods to avert what would undoubtedly be a war between two powerful houses. Despite having more wealth, lands, and retainers than his older brother Remeti, Prince Nasim's jealousy was ever apparent. Whether Remeti was aware of his brother's jealousy, however, was not. His latest slight of not properly introducing his younger brother, complete with all his lengthy titles, proved to be the final straw in a stack that existed solely in Nasim's mind. Sabir, without question or complaint, slipped into the rooms of dozens of men, issuing warnings or passing the final judgment. But this latest request seemed unreasonable. First, the two houses were no strangers to each other. One was considered an extension of the other. Second, Sabir spent many hours on missions with the mercenaries of Remeti's estate. They were not slave assassins like him, but proper mercenaries who owned homes and fathered children. Sabir dared to say they were his friends and not likely to let him walk out of the estate after killing their patron. Finally, Sabir admired Remeti. He was honorable. He would not sully his estate with slaves like his master, and said as much on many occasions, even offering Sabir refuge if he was willing to ever leave his brother. In the Tiram Basin, a wide, fertile plain located south of the great desert that separated the deep south from the Midlands, there were hundreds of princes, but no king. Thus, they all ruled their lands with their own laws. Within Sumatra, the jeweled city of the south, they each controlled large swaths and vied for control. The infighting led to mercenaries forming guilds that sold slave soldiers or provided troops to support whichever house was willing to pay for their services. The princes had wealth in abundance and paid mightily for killers, cutthroats, and assassins. Among these groups, none were as sought after as the Arkesh, raised from birth to be killers. Sabir was exceptional even among these elite killers. When asked to kill, rarely did Sabir consider the consequences beyond his covert escape. If he were truly to kill Remeti, he would have to kill members of Raven's Den. The same mercenary band also raised and trained the Arkesh. Although there were no laws against it, it didn't seem right. The sanctioned murder of a prince, members of his own organization, and the resulting civil war appeared relevant enough for him to bring to the very top, even though he was not allowed to discuss such indiscretions with anybody who was not in service to his present master. Sabir prepared himself as he would any other request from his master, but before he committed to the deed, he would at least seek out another solution. His master was petty and insecure. He suffered the sickness of affluenza. So rich, so entitled, he lost his ability to empathize with others. If a man crossed the street too slowly, he took it as a personal insult and would order the man killed then and there. As a member of the royal family, he was immune to the laws within his borough and would rewrite the laws frequently to accommodate his whims. But the murder of a royal was a new benchmark. As a slave, Sabir would carry out the orders given to him by his master, but there was one other who had the power to halt this ridiculous plot. It might cost him his life, but Sabir was ready to die if it meant he would prevent a civil war. Sabir approached the gates of his old home and training grounds. He didn't recognize any of the guards standing watch, but they knew him well. Each aspired to kill him someday in hopes of taking his title. His reputation had preceded him as the runners ran to announce his presence and query the reason for his return. Normally, an Arkesh would never return unless his master was slain. Sabir whispered his request into the ear of one runner and followed the other to the antechamber. His presence seemed to cause a stir as speculation about why he had returned took on a life of its own. After a time, Sabir was shown in. He counted 9 Arkesh peering down at him. There was no doubt they knew of his title. It would not be long before one of these impudent killers came to claim it. Like him, they were half-elf, half-human hybrid killers. Breed with the easily identifiable bronze-skinned humans from the deep south and the remnant of some elven slaves captured half a century ago. It was said this mix was the strongest and stealthiest mix of humanoid blood possible. The heightened senses and physical prowess of the two races had reached storybook proportions. Sabir watched as they surrounded the self-appointed Lord Renaud Saxon, head of Raven's Den. He remained silent, and his Grand Vizier, Amodi, spoke on his behalf. "Speak," he said simply. Sabir summarized his reasoning as best as he could. He spoke of the likely outcomes if he were to carry out this fratricide, the retaliation that would ensue, and how many of his brothers and sisters would die. He ended with a low bow. "Did you not realize that by coming here, you have now placed culpability on our Lord for any of your impending deeds?" Amodi used the word impending, which Sabir noticed and took to mean the Lord would not step in. "I'm sorry, my lord, but I just thought—" "You didn't think." With a wave of his hand, the Grand Vizier dismissed the excessively large honor guard and waited patiently for the last man to leave the room before speaking again. "We are mercenaries," he said slowly in a mocking tone. "Where do you think people will turn when your civil war breaks out? Arkesh are nothing more than tools in the hands of their masters." The words hit Sabir hard. Never had he ever felt so insignificant. To have this bootlicker speak to him in this manner doubled the insult. As the Lord's lickspittle prattled on, Sabir envisioned the events to come in his head. This would only lead to more killing. He would start a never-ending cycle, his master only growing more confident, more audacious. It would leave every house in the city diminished, perhaps beyond repair. 1,000 different scenarios ran through his mind, each ending with Amodi's words. "Where do you think people will turn when your civil war breaks out?" Every word died on Sabir's lips. If compelled to kill his brothers in arms, it wouldn't be the first time. After all, he became Shafra by killing other assassins who held the position before him. It was also his prowess that gave his master the arrogance to kill so casually, he knew. Sabir looked up at the two men who mistook his silence for subservience. "When you leave here, you will do so without being seen. You will carry out the orders given to you by your master, and you will never speak of coming here to anybody." "Do you understand?" Amodi said with the last 3 words dripping in condescension. Sabir fell into himself. He knew what he had to do. Oddly, he felt a peace he had never felt before. When Sabir's eyes met Amodi's, the Grand Vizier's blood ran cold. He recognized Sabir's death gaze and knew his life was forfeit. The devoted servant had only enough time to utter a high-pitched stew before the born assassin lurched forward, killing him instantly. His airway was cut off, and his heart had been pierced no fewer than 3 times. Renaud turned to Sabir as if noticing him for the first time. Renaud stood to his full height. He was not panicked or in shock over the death of his most loyal servant. Instead, he gave the same slow grin Prince Nassim gave him only hours earlier. Renaud spoke to Sabir for the first time, probably ever. "I should have seen that coming. We gave you only 2 choices, not realizing there was a third. Renaud spoke with the calm of a priest, reassuring his flock. He unsheathed his sword, a black greatsword that had smoky black wisps of miasma emanating from it. If cut by this blade, the wound would never heal, Sabir knew. He had seen Renaud wield a sword in battle several times. He was a skilled swordsman as far as fighting battles was concerned, but dueling an Arkesh was pure hubris. Sabir surmised that a lifetime of assassins bowing before him gave him a false sense of his abilities. "What is your plan? Kill me and take over. Have you what it takes to lead a band of mercenaries?" Renaud could not have been any further from the truth. Could it really be that hard to understand his motivations, he wondered. "You would have me kill a prince, start a civil war, and forever have to kill my brothers and sisters?" Sabir questioned. "So it is escape you seek? Why not nod your head in agreement, then run off into the night? You could be 20 miles gone before anyone notices you had left." That possibility seemed to be the smartest, but had never crossed Sabir's mind. He had been a slave all his life. His aspirations were much simpler than any self-proclaimed noble could ever fathom. "Ah, I get it," Renaud said. "You still seek to save your master's house, even if it means killing him to do it." The mercenary leader shook his head in disappointment, as if he was considering promoting Sabir until he understood his motivations. Renaud squared his shoulders and took a battle-ready stance. Time for words was at an end. Sabir drew the pair of short swords he wore crossed on his back and assumed a low, crouching stance with his arms held wide. Renaud didn't call for his guard. There was little chance they would have heard his plea in any case. Instead, he attacked, coming forward with inhuman agility. Sabir was barely able to get his blades up in time to deflect the blow. His years of endless training afforded him the ability to counter, but the deflection was purely aimed at creating space for the assassin. He had not anticipated Renaud closing the distance so fast. It had been years since Sabir could say he didn't have a distinct advantage in speed. Yet somehow, this human, closer to 50 than he was to 40, was faster and hit with the power of a man many times his size. Renaud pressed his advantage, raining blow after blow, backing the assassin and not giving him time or the space needed to attack. Sabir resorted to running and throwing furniture. Anything to get out of reach of that nasty blade. Sabir made the error of attempting to block rather than parry the blows as he started to run out of room. As the blade was halted, the miasma continued to descend, burning Sabir on his shoulder, chest, and back. The Arkesh had no reaction. He simply backed the mercenary leader up with a kick aimed at his head. It granted Sabir a moment of reprieve, but more important, an insight into how the old man was able to move with so much strength and agility. A moment before he continued his attack, the bangle on his right wrist lit dimly. The light was imperceptible to human eyes, but Sabir was half-elf, and to him it was a beacon. On the same hand was a ring Renaud wore on his middle finger. Sabir could see that this was the source of the miasma that coated his blade. As Renaud rained down blow after blow, he gave Sabir another tell. His mouth, which had been gritted moments earlier, parted a bit. It appeared the inhuman agility and strength provided by the bangle didn't supply stamina. The blows still came too fast to counter, but with less frequency as Sabir continued to evade. The two warriors did multiple circuits around the room. Renaud continued pressing his attack, while Sabir masterfully dodged, deflected, and evaded each and every attack. It wouldn't be much longer now, Sabir knew, as Renaud began breathing heavily. Renaud's eyes darted briefly toward the exit. He started to realize that, with all his advantages, the gap in skill was too great, and he would not be able to keep up his all-out assault. He had cast the die, and now it was too late to make changes. He came on again. This time Sabir feigned a retreat, prompting Renaud forward, only to be met with a riposte, followed by a hail of blades moving too fast for the large, bulky sword to deflect them all. Those attacks were feints themselves, as Sabir's real target was Renaud's wrist. Sabir's left hand came down in a blur, removing Renaud's hand from the rest of his arm. The cut was so clean, Renaud didn't realize what had happened until the blade returned to its normal metallic color. His right hand was still curled around the hilt of the sword, but no longer attached to his wrist. Renaud, since he was using both hands, was able to maintain possession of his weapon. However, in his weaker hand. Sabir could see trepidation in Renaud's eyes for the first time. Regret and now fear painted his face like a performer at a carnival. Sabir almost felt pity for his former master. The great sword, which was so light in Renaud's hands only an instant ago, was now heavy and hard to manipulate in his offhand. Sabir knew what came next. The powerful man would offer money and status. When that didn't work, he would try to reason. In the end, he would either choose to beg or mount an all-out assault, tantamount to a suicide charge. Sabir feared this man most of all, and the thought of him in tears begging for his life unsettled him. Sabir ended it without another word. His hidden wrist dagger shot out and retracted just as fast, leaving a small puncture wound over Renaud's heart. The large man jolted, then relaxed as he realized he was dead. No final words, just regret for dismissing his guards the one time he actually needed them. As the former mercenary leader slid to the floor, Sabir was gripped with fear and something else he had never felt. It was excitement, it was freedom. His mind raced. He had not planned to kill the heads of Raven's Den, but their complacency in the impending war made them as much at fault as his master. No, his former master. Sabir gathered the enchanted ring and bangle. The pair would make him more formidable if he could figure out how they worked. Although the greatsword was a master-worked blade worth a small fortune, he had a distaste for heavy two-handed weapons and didn't want to be slowed down. It didn't fit his fighting style anyway. As a slave, he had a limited concept of how currency worked, but he knew gold and jewels were valuable, so he gathered as much as he could, which turned out to be a small fortune and disappeared into the night. He would do as Renaud suggested and be 20 miles gone by daylight, but before he started his new life, he needed to end his former. He would pay his former master a visit and thank him formally for his newfound freedom, then end him, ensuring Rametti and his family would be safe. A slave killing his master was the biggest crime anyone could commit in Sumatra. That was enough to have an entire guild set upon you. Sabir could only imagine what killing the guildmaster would bring about.